A teen called the 84-year-old veteran useless. Then a group of soldiers surrounded him in silence. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and car exhaust as the afternoon settled into a dull stillness. On the corner of Maple and Fifth, an old man sat at the bus stop, his spine straight despite the years that had clearly bent his frame. His boots were scuffed and sun-faded, laces tucked in tight. A jacket, threadbare at the elbows, covered a plaid shirt buttoned to the top. On his head, a service cap sat slightly tilted, the embroidered patch worn smooth from age and weather. He didn't move much, only shifted now and then to ease the ache in his knees. His hands rested atop a cane, calloused and veined, knuckles swollen with time. He watched the street with the quiet stillness of someone used to waiting, used to being overlooked. A teenager slumped on the bench beside him, thumbs flicking across a phone screen with surgical detachment. Hood up, earbuds in, sneakers spotless. Every few seconds, the boy glanced sideways at the old man, brows creased in a mix of boredom and judgment. He pulled out one earbud. "You been sitting here long, old-timer?" The man didn't answer, just blinked slowly and looked away. The teen smirked. "Bet you ain't even going anywhere. Probably just comes out here to breathe dust and pretend the world remembers him." The man didn't flinch, didn't shift. His eyes were steady on a dog across the street dragging a leash and sniffing everything in sight. "People like you," the teen muttered, shaking his head, "just taking up space. Useless." The words hung there a moment, not shouted, just tossed like a pebble meant to sting. The man didn't meet his gaze, didn't need to. His silence pressed back harder than any insult. "Whatever," the teen scoffed, sliding his earbuds back in. He leaned away, as though even proximity to the man was contagious with irrelevance. Across the street, inside a coffee shop with sun-washed windows, 4 soldiers sat at a corner table. They weren't in uniform, but the way they sat, alert, back straight, eyes scanning, gave them away. One of them, tall with a trimmed beard, lowered his cup mid-sip. His eyes locked on the old man's cap. His face changed, just slightly, but enough to make the others turn and follow his gaze. No one said a word. Chairs scraped the floor as they stood, moving with purpose toward the bus stop. The teen didn't notice. The old man did, but he didn't react. He just exhaled through his nose, slow and even, the way a man might breathe just before a storm. The teen pulled one earbud out again, chuckling to himself. The bus still hadn't come, and silence was starting to itch at him. He glanced at the old man, eyes lingering on the frayed cuffs, the crooked stitching on the jacket, the scuffed boots that looked like they'd walked through 3 wars and hadn't been cleaned since. "You actually think anyone cares you wore that uniform?" he said, voice louder now, testing the air. A woman walking her dog paused just slightly before continuing past, gaze fixed straight ahead. "Look at you." The teen laughed, turning so his knees pointed at the man. "Sitting here like you're something. You're not. You're just another wrinkled nobody with a dumb old hat and a stick." "What's that?" "Your decoration." He pointed at the cane, snorting. "Should have stayed home, Grandpa." Still, the man didn't react. His hands rested on the cane, fingers curled but unmoved. His eyes didn't waver from the street. "Can't even talk," the teen pushed. "Guess they don't teach basic manners in dinosaur school." "Or maybe your brain's gone toosin', huh?" A kid on a skateboard rolled past and gave a quick look over his shoulder but didn't stop. A man sipping coffee under a nearby awning shifted awkwardly. No one said anything. No one ever did. The teen leaned back against the bench, triumphant in his own way. He smirked at the cars passing, then back at the old man. "I bet the only thing you ever fought was arthritis." The sun glinted off the old man's cap, catching a faded insignia that time had nearly erased. His face remained still, lips pressed together, not tight with anger, just closed. "Set. You know what I think," the teen said, louder now. "You guys talk about sacrifice and service like it makes you special, like it means something now. But you're just... He spread his arms as if presenting an exhibit. What happens when history forgets? Someone from across the street lowered their phone, unsure whether to step in or just record. And then, quiet footsteps, boots on concrete. The old man didn't turn. He didn't have to. His fingers tapped once against the cane, a rhythm almost, like checking a watch no longer needed. The teen noticed the shadow first, long, stretching toward him across the pavement, then another and another. He looked up. The old man, for the first time, shifted his gaze, but it wasn't to the teen. It was past him, toward the four figures now standing just behind the bench, shoulder to shoulder, eyes steady, not saying a word. The boy frowned. What is this? Some kind of joke? No one answered. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the edge of the old man's coat. He didn't look at the teen, not once. Just reached slowly with one hand, tugged the fabric tighter around his shoulders, and settled it with a tug at the collar. The movement was calm, practiced, like it had been done 1,000 times before on colder mornings than this one. His face held no anger, no hurt, just that same quiet stare fixed on the traffic light down the street, like he was waiting for something more important than insults. The teen shifted, suddenly unsure. The silence wasn't the kind he expected. It wasn't the kind that screamed weakness or embarrassment. It wasn't even the kind that gave him power. It was the kind that made noise feel small. "You deaf or something?" he asked, a little quieter now. No response. Just a slow breath through the nose, the kind that speaks of patience earned over decades, not seconds, the kind that doesn't need to answer to children. The old man leaned slightly forward, both hands resting on the cane now. His eyes squinted as a bus came into view far down the road, still 2 lights away. He gave it a glance, then returned to watching the sidewalk as though the boy wasn't there, as though he'd never been. A car passed by, playing music too loud, the bass vibrating through the metal bench, still no reaction, just the soft creak of old leather as the man shifted again, settling in. His breathing didn't change. The teen opened his mouth, then closed it. Across the street, one of the soldiers folded his arms. Another clenched his jaw and took a step forward, but the tall one, the one who recognized the cap, held out a hand without speaking. Not yet. Something about the old man's stillness seemed sacred now. Like interrupting it would be wrong, like speaking over it would be blasphemy. The teen sat back, suddenly aware of how loud he had been, of how small he now felt beside someone who hadn't said a single word. The old man's hand rose once more, not in defense, not in anger, but just to gently adjust the brim of his cap against the sun. The threadbare embroidery caught the light again. Faint outlines of honor, of units disbanded and battles long since faded from memory. But he wore it still. Not to be seen, but because it was part of him. That silence didn't shrink in the space between them. It grew. And with each passing second, it said more than shouting ever could. The clink of ceramic mugs and the low hum of conversation filled the cafe. Sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, slicing the room into warm strips of light and shadow. In the corner by the window sat 4 soldiers in plain clothes, jeans, hoodies, jackets that still somehow carried the posture of uniforms. Their laughter was low, easy, edged with the comfort of being off duty for once. Then one of them, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, a scar just above his right brow, fell quiet mid-sentence. His eyes drifted past the rim of his coffee cup to the bus stop across the street. "What is it?" one of the others asked, following his gaze. Across the road, the old man sat still on the bench, his profile sharp against the afternoon light. Beside him, the teenager was talking, moving too much, too loud for the moment. You could tell even from here. The boy leaned forward, gesturing with his phone, shaking his head with exaggerated disdain. but it was the old man's cap that had caught the soldier's eye. He leaned closer to the glass, narrowed his eyes. "Is that?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What?" another soldier asked, straightening. The first soldier didn't answer right away. He was studying the patch, not just the insignia, but the wear of it, the way the threading had frayed only in places a hand would often touch, the angle it sat on the man's head, the way the man didn't flinch or blink when the teenager's voice grew sharper. It wasn't just a cap, it was a history book. He stood. "Hey," one of the others said. "What's going on?" The tall soldier stepped away from the table, still watching. "That's a Ghost Recon patch. Not just standard. That design, he had to have served Black Ops, real old school." "No way," said the smallest of the group. "That thing's from, like, Vietnam days?" "Yeah," the first soldier said. "That's what I mean." They all turned toward the window now, watching the bench in silence, watching the boy's mouth move, watching the old man do absolutely nothing but sit and breathe and endure. The scarred soldier exhaled slowly, then headed for the door. The others followed, without needing to be told. They didn't rush, they didn't shout, they didn't even finish their drinks. Some things demanded presence more than words. As they crossed the street, traffic paused for them without the need of a signal. Just something in the way they moved, deliberate, focused. Inside the cafe, the barista leaned toward the window. "Where are they going?" The manager looked too, brow furrowed. "I don't know. But they're walking like they've just been given orders." The bell above the cafe door jingled once more as it closed, and the street outside grew quieter. The first soldier stepped off the curb with the calm precision of someone who'd marched on hotter ground. The others followed, boots silent against the pavement, their formation unspoken but certain. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. There was a current between them, something electric beneath the still afternoon, something that pulled the sidewalk taut like a tripwire about to snap. Across the street, the teenager was still talking. "You just gonna sit there like a statue," he said, louder now, emboldened by the silence. "Guess that's all you got left, huh? Sitting and rotting." He laughed once, sharp and dry. "Bet you don't even remember your name." The old man blinked slowly. He didn't shift, didn't lift his head, just stayed exactly as he was, as if he hadn't heard a word, or maybe he had, and had already judged it not worth responding to. The soldiers were halfway there now. The teen didn't notice. His eyes were on the old man's cap again, that faded insignia. He pointed, scoffing. "That's supposed to mean something. You guys all act like wearing that hat makes you heroes or something." A car passed between the soldiers and the sidewalk. When it cleared, they were closer. Their shadows stretched long ahead of them, the sun behind them turning their faces to silhouettes. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves of the nearby oak trees. A flag above the post office across the street tugged once at its pole, then stilled. The old man's cane tapped lightly once against the pavement, a signal, maybe, or maybe just memory moving through muscle. The teenager kept on. "I don't get it. People treat you guys like gods. Just because you got old and fought in some war no one even remembers." A toddler held tight to his mother's hand nearby, slowing as they passed. The mother looked toward the soldiers approaching and instinctively held her child closer. The first soldier reached the edge of the sidewalk. His boot touched the concrete with a whisper. The teen finally sensed something, a ripple, a break in the air, a weight he couldn't name. He turned his head just slightly, brows knitting. "What the—" He trailed off. 4 men now stood behind him, close, not crowding but undeniable. Each wore something different, hoodies, a bomber jacket, plain jeans, but somehow they all looked dressed for the same occasion. Silence wrapped the stop like fog. The old man finally looked up, not at the teen. Past him, toward the soldiers. His gaze lingered on the tall one at the front. Recognition passed between them. Nothing was said, but everything changed. The soldiers moved like a tide, silent, steady, inevitable. They didn't speak. They didn't rush. But each step felt rehearsed, purposeful, like they'd done this before, 1,000 times under far worse skies. The teen stood now, unease tightening his shoulders. His smirk faltered as the first soldier passed him without a glance, taking position beside the old man on the left. Another stepped behind the bench, hands folded in front of him, posture rigid but not tense. Then a third, to the right. The last stood just behind, close enough that his shadow reached over the teen's shoes. It wasn't hostile. It was reverent. The old man didn't turn, didn't flinch. He shifted his cane slightly to one side, making space without being asked. His breathing stayed even, calm. Like this moment was familiar, not surprising, like he had waited for it. The teen looked from one soldier to the next. What is this?" No one answered. The formation held tight around the bench, around the man still sitting beneath the rusted metal shelter. People across the street slowed their steps. Some paused. A couple phones rose, quiet and tentative. "Are you guys with him?" the teen asked, taking half a step back. He laughed nervously, trying to find a handle on the moment. "What? Is this some reunion or something?" Still no reply, only the sound of wind brushing across the sidewalk, the occasional whoosh of a passing car, the quiet tick of the crosswalk signal changing. A breeze lifted the brim of the old man's cap, just enough to reveal the lined edge of his temple, scarred, pale, weathered like old stone. One of the soldiers, tall, with a square jaw and a faint silver streak at his temple, lowered his head slightly in respect. Just once. Then returned to stillness. The teen shifted again, voice thinner now. "Look, I was just talking. I didn't mean anything by it." The soldier behind the bench finally spoke, voice low and level. "Then why were you yelling?" The teen blinked. It wasn't like that." Another voice joined, deeper from the one at the old man's side. "You called him useless." The teen opened his mouth, closed it. His hands fidgeted at his sides. He looked at the old man, who hadn't moved, hadn't even looked at him. He didn't need to, surrounded now not by threat but by memory, by loyalty, by living shadows of a brotherhood that stretched across generations. The teen took a step back, then another, and for the first time that day, he was quiet. The silence deepened, thick and strange, like a blanket had been dropped over the street. Even the distant rumble of traffic seemed to dim. The four soldiers stood like stone, framing the old man in stillness. Eyes fixed, backs straight. The sun had slipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the sidewalk and bench. Then the tall soldier stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he was walking on sacred ground. His boots made no sound. He stopped just in front of the old man, not too close, not crowding, and looked down at the figure sitting quiet and still. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached up and, with a single smooth motion, brought his hand to his brow in a sharp salute. The motion was crisp, pure. Not for show, not for the cameras. It was the kind of salute only one soldier gives another when words are too small for the weight of a moment. The old man didn't move right away. His eyes lifted, not wide, not surprised, just present. He met the younger man's gaze, and for a moment, time collapsed between them. Without a word, the other three followed. One by one, they stepped into place beside the first and raised their hands in the same solemn gesture. No commands, no cues, just instinct and respect. The street fell quiet. A dog stopped barking 3 houses down. A baby in a stroller looked up and didn't cry. The wind held its breath. People across the road had stopped walking. A couple near the corner gasped without sound. A woman clutched her shopping bag tighter against her chest, as if bracing for a truth she hadn't expected to see. The teenager stood frozen, watching them with wide eyes. He didn't speak, didn't even shift. It was as if someone had turned the volume of his world all the way down, and suddenly he could hear everything else for the first time. His own heartbeat, the flap of the flag across the street, the echo of his own words hanging in the air like smoke. The old man finally straightened his back, slowly, as though uncoiling something buried deep. His right hand left the cane and lifted, not quickly, not perfectly, but with the weight of every year it carried. He returned the salute. It wasn't dramatic. It was dignified. And somehow it felt louder than any speech. The soldiers held their salute for one long breath more, then lowered their hands in unison. Still, no one spoke. They didn't have to. Respect had already spoken for them. The lead soldier took a step closer, lowering his hand slowly, reverently. He looked straight into the old man's eyes, not with pity, not with the wide-eyed awe people sometimes reserve for stories they don't understand, but with recognition. A kind of quiet knowing, carved out of experience. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, his tone full of something deeper than ceremony. "On behalf of all of us, thank you for everything." The old man said nothing. His lips pressed into the faintest line. His eyes stayed locked on the soldiers, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. It was like a nod without motion. A shared understanding only people who had seen the same darkness could ever truly carry. Behind the soldier, the others shifted, barely. One bowed his head. Another adjusted his stance. But no one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of the thank you had filled the air. The old man's hand fell back to his cane slowly, as if time had caught up again. He didn't smile, didn't offer anything in return, but his posture changed. Straighter now, like the years had peeled back just slightly to reveal something still intact beneath it all. Across the street, the cafe door creaked open. A young woman with an apron stood holding a to-go cup halfway to her lips, frozen mid-sip. Her eyes glistened as she watched. The teen stood awkwardly a few steps away, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes on the ground. He kicked at a loose pebble near his shoe and looked up, just once, toward the old man. The veteran's gaze didn't drift toward him. It stayed with the soldier, who now took another step back, standing at ease, his voice quieter now. "My grandfather told me stories," he said, "about a man who taught survival tactics to his unit back in the 80s. Made them drink from puddles, scale trees with wire, live off roots and rainwater for a week. Said he'd never forget it." The soldier gave a short laugh, more breath than sound. He said the guy was a ghost, never took credit, never stayed in one place long. Just made sure they came home. He looked back at the others, who gave small nods in return. "Been a long time," he added, returning his gaze to the old man. "But we've heard the name, even if no one else remembers." The old man finally spoke, voice like gravel and wind. "Names don't matter." The soldier didn't argue, just nodded once, slow and firm. "Maybe not," he said, "but respect does." And this time, the old man didn't look away. The teen's mouth was still half open, frozen somewhere between another insult and a comeback he couldn't remember. The smirk he'd worn so confidently had vanished, peeled away by the silence that now surrounded the old man like armor. He glanced around. At first it was just confusion, plain and raw, the kind that crept in when the world suddenly stopped playing by your rules. He looked from one soldier to the next, each of them stone still, eyes forward, shoulders squared like monuments. Then his eyes drifted to the old man again. He was no longer just a stranger on a bench. He was something else now, and the teen didn't have a name for it. Who is this guy?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The question didn't deserve an answer. Not yet. Not when it came from a place of panic instead of respect, not when the weight of his own words hadn't settled fully on him. He stepped back a little, instinctively, like distance might undo what had just happened. But the soldiers didn't move. The circle around the old man remained tight, not defensive, not aggressive, just solid, like they were protecting something sacred, like they were part of a tradition bigger than themselves. The teen's gaze dropped to the cap again. That old, faded cap that earlier had looked like nothing more than a piece of thrift store junk. Now he saw the stitching differently, not just thread, but stories, years, weight. He swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he muttered. Still, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier now than anything he'd said before. He shifted awkwardly, his sneakers scuffing the concrete. His hands rubbed together, nerves building in his fingers. A moment ago, he'd felt tall, loud, sure of himself. Now, he felt like a kid again. One who'd said something he didn't understand in a room he didn't belong in. "I just thought he was... I don't know." The words died on his tongue. He didn't even believe them anymore. From the side of the bench, one of the soldiers turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the boy's eyes. There was no anger there, just disappointment, the kind that didn't need raised voices, the kind that left marks deeper than scolding. The teen looked down at his shoes. "I'm sorry," he said, quieter now. The old man didn't turn. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any acceptance or rejection. The teen stood there a second longer. Then he stepped back again, this time more carefully, his gaze lingering on the old man before dropping once more to the sidewalk. The bench, the boots, the cap. He didn't know who the man was. Not really. But he finally understood what he wasn't. And that was enough, for now. The air smelled like oil and dust. Boots thudded in rhythm on cracked concrete as the transport idled behind them, spitting black smoke into the pale morning sky. Rows of young men, barely out of high school, stood at attention, their faces pulled tight by nerves and pride. Among them, a boy barely 20 with close-cropped hair and wide eyes. His uniform still creased from the supply depot, his hands fidgeted at his sides, trying not to shake. He stood taller when the sergeant passed. That's what you did. You stood taller. Even when your stomach twisted and your heart pounded against your ribs like it wanted out. Especially then. He'd volunteered. Everyone back home had called him brave. Said things like, "Make us proud," and "Go show 'em." He'd smiled at his mother as he boarded the train and promised he'd write. But now, as he stared at the steel belly of the transport plane, reality pressed its hand against his chest. It was Korea, 1952. A war that wasn't called a war, and a front line that shifted like sand. They'd been told it would be cold, that the terrain was rough and the enemy clever. But what they hadn't been told, what you could never be told, was how loud fear could be when everything else went quiet. The boy, too young to be hardened, too old to be naive, tightened the strap on his pack and climbed the ramp. Inside, the others sat in silence. A few whispered prayers. One held a photo of a girl back home, tracing her outline with his thumb. The engines roared. As the plane lifted off, he stared out the tiny porthole window. The world below grew small. Familiar roads and rooftops turned into shapes, then into nothing. His name was called 2 days later, on a freezing hillside outside Pyongyang. First patrol, first live round chambered. First taste of the weight a trigger could carry. He didn't speak much, just followed orders, eyes sharp. When the others joked, he listened. When they panicked, he stayed still. It wasn't that he was fearless. It was that he knew fear served no purpose once the shooting started. He learned quickly, learned how to patch a wound with half a field dressing and 2 fingers, learned how to listen for silence, because sometimes that meant the enemy was closer than sound, learned how to dig a foxhole in frozen earth using only a helmet and desperation. By the end of that winter, the wide-eyed recruit was gone. In his place, a soldier who spoke less, observed more, and understood the value of patience over pride. He didn't look for medals, didn't ask for thanks. He just made sure the men next to him got home. And when they didn't, he remembered every name. The memory came back in fragments, like everything that mattered most. Not in order, never in order. First came the smell, burnt cordite and blood-soaked canvas. Then the sound, not the crack of rifles, but the wet, ragged breath of the man over his shoulder. It had been dusk when the ambush hit. The patrol had been routine, whatever that meant in a place where nothing was. 8 men moving through a narrow pass near the river bend, boots sinking into half-frozen mud. And then, without warning, the ridge lit up, gunfire pouring down like rain with purpose. 3 went down in the first 5 seconds. 2 never got up again. He remembered diving behind a stump that wouldn't have stopped a strong breeze. He remembered his heart thudding against his ribs, not out of fear, but calculation. Where were they? How many? What angle? And then he saw him, Corporal Jennings. Hit in the leg, bleeding fast, crawling more from instinct than strength. The kid had only just gotten a letter from home that morning, folded it and tucked it in his breast pocket like it was armor. Another burst of gunfire cracked overhead. No orders came. The radio was down. Their squad leader was already gone. It was chaos, but not for him. He moved. No shouting, no pause. Just forward, he sprinted across open ground, bullets whipping past like angry hornets. He grabbed Jennings under the arms, hoisted him in one clean pull, and started running. The younger man screamed as his leg jolted. He didn't stop, didn't answer, just tightened his grip and kept moving, down into the ravine, through brush that clawed at their skin, over rocks slick with winter frost. Behind them, the fight raged. But the sound grew distant. Like thunder behind a door, Jennings passed out before they reached the tree line. He didn't notice. He just shifted the boy's weight and pressed on. 2 miles, maybe more. He couldn't remember exactly. All he knew was that when he finally reached the forward aid station, his arms felt like they'd been ripped from their sockets. His legs refused to hold him a second longer. He dropped to his knees just as the medics came running. "He's still breathing," he said, voice hoarse, throat raw. That's all he said. Later, the commander called it an act of extraordinary bravery. He called it duty. And when Jennings woke up in a hospital bed a week later, he asked why risk his life? The answer was simple. Quiet, honest, because you were still breathing. And that was reason enough. The orders came through weeks later, typed in stiff black letters on white military stationery, folded twice, and delivered without ceremony. He'd been recommended for a Silver Star. The official citation detailed exceptional valor under fire, disregard for personal safety, and successful extraction of wounded personnel from hostile territory. Words that read sharp and clean on paper, nothing like the dirty, breathless chaos they tried to describe. When the officer handed him the envelope, he barely looked at it, just nodded once and slid it into his duffel without comment. Later that night, he took it out, read it in the yellow light of a mess hall lamp, then folded it again and tucked it beneath his spare socks. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week. Brass from headquarters would be flown in, speeches, a photographer, polished boots, and stiff salutes. He was told to prepare a short statement. He didn't show. Instead, he volunteered for a forward supply run the morning of the event. A convoy of trucks headed through a frostbitten valley, dodging landmines and shell craters. He rode in the back, checking rations and gear, preferring the company of ammunition crates to applause. When they found out, a captain cornered him, asked why, demanded an explanation. He shrugged. "You don't need a medal to do what's right." The captain stared at him, unsure whether to reprimand or shake his hand. In the end, he did neither. The medal was sent by mail, along with a commendation letter from someone with stars on their shoulder who'd never stepped foot near the fight. He never opened the box. Just placed it at the bottom of his footlocker, beneath a photograph of his unit and a copy of The Old Man and the Sea that he reread between deployments. When other soldiers talked about what they'd seen, he listened. When they boasted about kills or near misses, he nodded politely. When someone asked what he'd done, he said, "Got lucky, still breathing," and then changed the subject. He wasn't there for decorations. He was there to make sure the kid beside him got home. That was it. That was always it. He never told anyone about the second rescue, or the night he spent holding pressure on a gut wound until medics arrived, or the time he stood watch for 23 hours straight because the new guy kept falling asleep at the post. He didn't want to be remembered for heroics. He wanted to be remembered by the ones who made it home, and even then, not with speeches or plaques, just with a nod if they ever crossed paths again. Maybe a shared drink, a quiet moment. That was enough. He didn't start the journal for himself, not at first. The first name was written on a night soaked in rain, in a foxhole that smelled like wet earth and fear. Private Ellis, 19. The kind of kid who cracked jokes in the worst moments, who always gave his extra rations away and claimed he wasn't hungry. They found him just past the ridge, caught in the open when the mortars started. He never had a chance. The old man, then still just a soldier with a tired back and steady hands, sat down that night with a stub of pencil and an empty field notebook. He turned to the back page and wrote Ellis's name in careful block letters. No rank, no cause of death, just a name, a life. A promise that it wouldn't be forgotten. He never stopped writing them. Sometimes he added a short note beneath, "Ran the wire line under fire. Gave me his coat. Last thing he said was, 'Tell my mom I'm not scared.'" Sometimes there was no note, just a name and the date. That was enough. The journal stayed folded in the inside pocket of every jacket he wore. It went with him to training camps, to field hospitals, into the jungle, across the mountains. It was worn now, creases soft as linen, corners frayed, pages curled at the edge like leaves pressed into a book. Some names were smudged from rain or sweat. Some had stars next to them. A few were underlined. He'd flipped through it on long nights when sleep wouldn't come, his eyes tracing each name like a prayer. His lips never moved. He never read them aloud. That kind of thing was for chaplains and ceremonies. This was something different, private. Some of the newer guys caught glimpses of the book and asked what it was. He'd just shake his head and say, "Memories I owe." They didn't push. He'd learned quickly that war wasn't a place. It was a ledger. Every bullet, every breath, every name. Some debts you paid with sweat. Others you carried. There was one page near the middle of the journal that had only a single word written on it. Why? No date, no name. He never turned to that page unless he was alone. He remembered them all, not because he had to, but because it was the only way to honor what they gave. Their faces would come back sometimes, uninvited, vivid, too clear for comfort. A smirk, a laugh, a look of surprise that never turned into fear. Always just before. He couldn't save them all, but he could remember that much, at least. And that journal, soft and silent against his chest, never let him forget. It started with a set of coordinates scribbled on a napkin and handed off without a word. No mission briefing, no formal orders. Just a nod from a man who wore no rank, and a plane waiting on a tarmac that didn't exist on any map. That's how it always was with these kinds of jobs. The ones no one admitted to, even after they were over. There were 5 of them. No uniforms, no dog tags. Just gear packed in silence and weapons cleaned without conversation. The only thing that tied them together was trust, and even that was earned minute by minute, mile by mile. They were told there were hostages, civilians, maybe aid workers. Maybe someone important enough to warrant the silence, but not enough to bring cameras. He didn't ask questions. The chopper dropped them 5 clicks from the compound, somewhere in the jungle, under a moon choked by clouds. The only light came from the red glow of a filtered flashlight and the dim hum of memory. He moved like the earth knew him, quiet, certain, invisible. They all did. That's what made them ghosts. The compound was worse than expected, guarded, wired, watched, but they'd seen worse. He slipped in first, crawling beneath brush, bypassing tripwires by instinct more than sight. The others followed. What happened next didn't last long, but it stretched time thin, like a rubber band pulled to the breaking point. Shots were fired. A man screamed. But it was over before the noise could carry. They got in, got them out. 27 lives, shaking and stunned and barefoot, crammed into a truck that hadn't run in years until he kicked it into gear. One of the rescued held a child so tightly the kid's face was pressed to her shoulder the entire ride back. No one spoke. No one cried. It was too soon for either. They left no trace. Back at base, if it could be called that, there was no welcome, no debrief. Just hot coffee and silence. The 5 of them stood together for a moment, and then someone said, "That'll do," and walked away. The others followed. He stayed behind. Watched the rescued load onto a transport plane, some still barefoot, some wrapped in military jackets 2 sizes too big. One of them, a man with a broken arm and eyes like cracked glass, paused at the top of the ramp and gave a small nod. That was all. The mission was never filed. No medals, no mention. Years later, even he couldn't find a record of it, like it had been erased on purpose, but he remembered every face. And sometimes, when the wind hit just right, he could still hear the click of that faulty engine turning over in the dark, carrying hope through the trees. That was enough. The bus dropped him off 2 miles from town, just past the old grain mill that had been rusting since before he'd left. No one was there to greet him, not because they didn't care, but because he hadn't told anyone he was coming. That's how he wanted it. No signs, no speeches, no welcome home parades, just the crunch of gravel under worn boots and the feel of familiar soil beneath him. He walked the rest of the way, duffel over his shoulder, jacket zipped up against the wind. The town hadn't changed much. Same drugstore with the crooked E in the neon sign, same barber still smoking on the stoop like he had when the old man left, decades ago. He moved into a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just wood and nails, most of which he replaced himself. He rebuilt the porch first, didn't like the way it groaned under weight, then the roof, then the floors. His hands remembered things long before his mouth ever would. People asked questions at first. The neighbors, the mailman, the kid at the hardware store. "You serve?" they'd ask, eyes flicking to the cap he wore sometimes when the sun got too high. He'd nod, sometimes he'd smile, but he never told them where or how long or what he saw. He didn't think the answers would help them sleep better. Instead, he fixed broken chairs and leaky faucets, rewired lamps and sanded floors. He never charged for any of it, just left things better than he found them. Once a month, he sat at the VFW hall with the other ghosts in the room. They didn't talk much either, just nodded when it counted. Young vets started showing up at his door eventually, not because he called them. Word just spread about the man who didn't speak of war but listened like no one else ever had. He taught them how to fix engines, how to patch drywall, how to steady their hands when the noise came back at night. He never gave advice, just tasks, measured work that kept the mind busy and the soul from unraveling. He built wheelchair ramps for free. Groceries showed up on porches without names on the bags. One winter, he cleared 6 driveways in a single morning, then disappeared before anyone could thank him. He never talked about what he'd done. But sometimes, when no one was around, he'd pull out the old journal from his coat pocket and run a hand across the names like they were carved in stone. and when someone passed him in town and nodded with quiet respect, he'd nod back, because that was enough. The teen hovered a few feet from the bench, arms stiff at his sides, his sneakers scuffing the sidewalk. The soldiers hadn't moved. The old man sat in the same quiet posture, hands resting on his cane, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. The silence had shifted from heavy to expectant, like the wind itself was waiting. The boy started, then stopped. His voice caught somewhere between his throat and his pride. He cleared it and tried again. I didn't mean what I said. Back there. The old man didn't look at him. I didn't know who you were. Still nothing. The teen swallowed, his voice cracking just slightly. Look, I was being a jerk. Okay? I get that. I didn't know. A nearby car rolled to a stop at the light. The driver glanced at the scene and turned off the radio. The boy took a breath. I was wrong. I'm sorry. He stood there, apology laid bare, awkward and raw, waiting for something. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe a scolding. Maybe just to be told what to feel so he could stop feeling like this. Finally, the old man moved. He didn't look at the teen, not right away. He just adjusted his grip on the cane, his fingers steady, then turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes met the boy's, not with anger, but with the weight of too many years spent watching the world forget what it cost to build itself. It's not me you need to respect, he said, voice low, gravel-worn and even. It's what you take for granted. The boy blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. The old man continued, gaze unwavering. You think age makes someone useless. You think silence means weakness. You think freedom is something that just shows up and stays because you happen to be born into it. The teen said nothing. It's not, the old man said. It's earned, paid for, not by people like me. By people you've never met, who never came home. He tapped the cane once on the concrete, not loudly, just enough to make a point. You want to be better? He asked. Then stop looking at the world like it owes you something and start acting like you owe something back. The teen's mouth opened, then closed. He nodded, slowly, not to defend himself, not to argue, just to acknowledge it. The old man turned back to the street. And that was that. No lecture, no punishment, just truth. And in that truth, the boy didn't shrink. He stood a little straighter. The photo hit the internet before sunset. Someone had captured the moment the soldiers stood around the old man, the teen awkward and pale nearby, the salute frozen midair like a painting. No hashtags, no captions, just an image that said more than words could. By the next morning, the town had seen it. By noon, the story started. At the diner, a waitress wiped her hands on her apron and leaned across the counter to tell the reporter from the local paper, "He fixed my mom's porch last winter. Wouldn't take a penny." Said rotten steps weren't something a lady should be risking with bad knees. At the hardware store, the manager pulled a dusty ledger off a shelf and pointed to a name that showed up at least once a week. Never bought more than he needed, always paid in cash. Usually for someone else. At the elementary school, a teacher remembered him showing up unannounced with 10 birdhouses made from scrap wood. Left them at the front office with a note. For the science kids. Build something that lasts. Neighbors spoke up too. One woman said she hadn't seen him much, just noticed her mailbox stood straighter after a storm. Another recalled the night her power went out and someone knocked, handed her a lantern, then walked off into the dark before she could ask who. The pastor at the chapel told a different kind of story. He came every Sunday, he said. Didn't sing, didn't talk much, but after the service, he'd sweep the steps. Every single week. Like clockwork. Someone found out he'd delivered groceries to the senior center for 5 years. Quietly, early in the morning, before the place even opened. Left the bags with handwritten notes, things like, "You matter," and "Hope today's easier than yesterday." No name. No return address. Just decency, unadvertised. By evening, the bus stop had become a sort of gathering place. People came with coffee, folding chairs, candles they didn't light because it wasn't a vigil, just a moment, a pause, a breath of awareness. One man stood off to the side, arms crossed. "I served," he said softly to no one in particular, but he lived it and kept giving. A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed. "That's the man who fixed our fence." The mother nodded slowly. "That's him, baby." The old man didn't say anything about it. He didn't come to the gathering, didn't need to. He was home, sharpening an old chisel in his garage. The same way he had for years, still had work to do. But across town, strangers who had never spoken to each other were sharing stories, not about a hero, not about a legend, about a man who never asked to be seen, only to serve. And now, finally, people were seeing him. The precinct phone rang just after noon. Officer Ramirez picked it up, half expecting another noise complaint about teenagers at the skate park. Instead, it was a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade. Colonel David Green, retired, direct, calm, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "Is it true?" Green asked. "About the man at the bus stop?" Ramirez hesitated. "Yes, sir. Name's Briggs. Harold Briggs. Lives off Sycamore." There was a pause on the line. A deep one. Then the colonel said, "That man trained me." Ramirez blinked. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Green interrupted, "that everything I learned about leadership, about endurance, about surviving when things got bad, I learned from him. He didn't just train us, he carried us." The story had already been making the rounds, the photo, the teen, the soldiers, but now it shifted. Now it had weight, now it came with names. By afternoon, the station was quiet with a kind of reverence. Officers whispered in corners. Files were left half-processed. Ramirez stepped outside, leaning against the cruiser, watching the same intersection where it all started. The bench was empty now, but it felt charged, like the air around it remembered. A younger officer approached him. "You really think he trained generals?" Ramirez nodded. "Not just trained, shaped them." By sundown, the phones rang again, this time from higher up. A name came through the pipeline. General Marcus Ellison, 4 stars, commanded special operations, was flying in tomorrow, quietly, no press, no escort. Just to see a man who never asked to be remembered. Ramirez stood in the briefing room, staring at the map on the wall. "He taught survival to the ones who taught us everything," he said. "The man's fingerprints are on every generation of special forces since the 70s. Across the room, Officer Blake looked up from his desk. "So why is he still building ramps in our town like nobody knows his name?" Ramirez gave a tired smile. "Because that's who he is." Word spread quickly, not in headlines or breaking news alerts, but in quieter ways. A note passed at the barber shop, a whispered conversation at the diner, a message written in chalk outside the school. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." By nightfall, the street outside Briggs's house had a few more cars parked along the curb. Neighbors lingered longer in their yards. A young boy set down a small American flag in front of the porch, not for a photo, not for applause, just because it felt right. Inside, Harold sat in his chair, the same one he'd built 20 years ago, the same one that creaked in the same spot every time he leaned back. He didn't know who was coming, but he knew someone would, and he knew, though he wouldn't admit it, that maybe, just maybe, it was time. The car pulled up just after 10. It wasn't marked, just a dark sedan with windows tinted enough to keep curious eyes guessing. No motorcade, no flashing lights. Just the soft crunch of gravel as it eased into the driveway of the modest house, with the uneven shutters and the American flag hanging faded but firm by the porch. Harold was already outside, sitting on the steps with a cup of black coffee, steam rising steady in the morning chill. He didn't stand when the door opened. Didn't need to. Some greetings were better received from a seat of quiet strength. The man who stepped out of the car wore his uniform like armor, not in the way of ego, but memory. His medals caught the light, though he hadn't come to show them. He paused at the gate, removing his hat with a slow, practiced hand. "Permission to approach, Sergeant Major," he said, loud enough to carry but soft enough for privacy. Harold squinted through the sun. His mouth bent into a quiet curve, not quite a smile, but close. "Granted." The general crossed the yard in slow steps, as if each one brought him closer to something sacred. He stopped at the foot of the porch and looked at the man who had once barked orders across swamps and deserts, who had once tied a field tourniquet with a belt and a stick, who had once walked 3 miles on a torn ligament just to finish a lesson. "You haven't changed a bit," he said. "You got taller," Harold replied. "Or you shrunk," the general shot back, grinning. A pause. Then, without instruction, the general snapped to attention and offered a full salute. Crisp, sharp, absolute. Harold stood slowly but without help and returned it. The 2 men held it a moment longer than regulation would require. Then both dropped their hands, and the years between them folded away like paper. "Still drinking that terrible army coffee?" Harold asked, gesturing to the cup. "Only way I know how to start a day." They sat together on the porch. No fanfare. Just 2 men with too many shared stories to tell them all. The general glanced around at the tools, the neat rows of cut lumber, the ramps stacked neatly along the side of the house. "You still building for people? Still people who need building?" A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with all the things left unsaid. The general's voice softened. "They never told us it was you, that you were the one behind half our survival training. We thought the guy was a myth." "Good," Harold said. "Means you were paying attention, not chasing ghosts." The general chuckled. "You always were better in the shadows. That's where the work gets done." And in that quiet, coffee steaming between them, it was clear the stories were true, and they were only part of who he was. The next morning, the bench at the bus stop was empty, just like it always had been before the photo, before the crowd, before the soldiers. But something in the air still lingered, something quieter than attention, deeper than headlines. The teen showed up early, not because anyone told him to, not for an audience, just because he couldn't stop thinking about the man on the bench, the weight of those words, "It's not me you need to respect." He stood there a while, hands stuffed in his hoodie, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. Then he saw the figure approaching from down the street, slow, steady, coat zipped, boots thudding in rhythm with his cane. Harold didn't flinch at the sight of him, didn't change his pace. Just walked to the bench, settled in with the practiced care of someone whose bones had earned the right to move slowly, and exhaled like he had nowhere else to be. The boy hesitated, then nodded toward the space beside him. "Mind if I sit?" Harold gestured with one hand. Nothing grand, just enough to say if you're quiet, you're welcome. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Cars passed. A school bus rumbled by. The world didn't pause. But something between them had... The teen finally broke the stillness. "I used to think people like you were just old, like the past. I didn't get it." Harold didn't reply, not right away. He simply looked out at the street, watching the world go on. "I read about you," the boy continued, "after everything. The missions, the stuff they don't talk about, what you did for people here." Harold nodded once, not in approval, just acknowledgement. "I've never really done anything," the teen said. "Not like that." Harold turned to look at him then, his gaze steady, not sharp. "Yet," the boy blinked. "What? You've never done anything yet. That's not the same as never doing anything." That landed heavier than the teen expected. He looked down at his hands. They weren't scarred or calloused, just young, untested. Harold took a slow sip from the thermos he always carried. You don't measure a man by what he says, not even by what he's done. You measure him by what he does next. The boy nodded, slowly this time. He didn't say much after that, just sat there, letting the silence teach him something no classroom ever could. They watched the morning go by together, side by side. No speeches, no spotlight, just space for change to take root. When the bus finally arrived, the teen didn't get on. He had somewhere else to be. The first ramp went up behind the Clark's house. No one asked them if they needed it. Everyone already knew. Mr. Clark had taken a fall 2 winters ago, and the back steps had become more of a wall than an entryway. A few neighbors showed up on a Saturday morning with lumber, drills, and quiet resolve. By lunch, the ramp was done. By dinner, someone had stenciled a name into the corner post. Briggs Built. They didn't ask Harold for permission. They just figured he wouldn't mind. Word spread fast. At first, it was just little things. Trash picked up from the creek bed, groceries left on doorsteps, driveways shoveled before sunrise, but then someone printed flyers. The Briggs Challenge. It read, "Do good, don't ask for credit. Leave it better than you found it." No sponsors, no signatures, just that. The library started keeping a tally board, not for names, but for deeds. Helped fix a fence. 1 tally. Walked a neighbor's dog every morning. 2. Left an extra coat at the shelter. 3. No prizes. No leaderboard. Just lines on paper that quietly reminded the town who they really were when no one was watching. High school students took it up like a dare. The same kids who once laughed at early morning silence were now up before dawn, painting the community center walls. One of them stood outside the grocery store on a rainy Tuesday with a handmade sign, "Need help carrying your bags? No charge." A retired teacher baked extra pies each weekend and sent them to families she knew were struggling. The mechanic down on 3rd stopped charging for minor repairs on old vehicles, just taped a note to the dashboard. Briggs would have done it. Even the mayor got involved. Quietly, he started visiting the nursing home every Sunday, sitting with residents who didn't have family nearby. He didn't bring reporters. No one took photos. People stopped waiting for someone else to step up. They just stepped. And every once in a while, they'd catch sight of the old man himself, walking slow with that same cane, nodding once at the new ramp, the fresh coat of paint, the cleared sidewalk. He never said much, but his eyes held something like pride, but deeper, steadier. At the center of it all, Harold never changed. He still woke up early, still fixed what was broken, still kept the names in his pocket and the silence in his stride. But now, when he passed someone on the street, they didn't just nod. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work. Because in a town that had finally remembered what respect looked like, the best way to honor it was to earn it. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, no ceremony, no special delivery, just tucked among the usual stack of flyers and bills, its weight barely different from the rest. But the return address caught Harold's eye. Department of Defense, Washington, D.C. He turned it over in his hands slowly, the thick paper firm beneath his fingers. The seal on the flap was unbroken, the ink dark and official. He didn't open it right away. Just set it on the kitchen table beside his coffee and stared out the window for a while, watching the wind bend the branches of the sycamore in his yard. The house was quiet, as always. No TV, no radio. Just the soft tick of the old wall clock and the occasional creak of floorboards settling into the day. Eventually, he slid his thumb beneath the seal and opened the letter with the same deliberate care he used to clean a rifle. Inside, a single page, cream-colored, heavy. Embossed at the top with an eagle and gold lettering, it read like a script from another life. In recognition of your actions during classified operations between 1975 and 1987, your conduct has been reviewed and deemed worthy of formal commendation. Your record, previously held under restricted clearance, has been updated to reflect extraordinary service under conditions of extreme risk. We regret the delay in this acknowledgement. Beneath that, a signature, a name he didn't recognize, a general, no doubt. One of the new ones. Harold read it twice, not because he needed to, but because old habits died hard. He folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then he sat for a long time, the corners of his mouth neither up nor down, just still. He glanced toward the drawer near the fridge, the one with the medals he never wore, the commendations he never displayed, the ones that came late, or came quietly, or came not at all. And now, this one, too. He didn't reach for the drawer. Instead, he stood, walked to the garage, and pulled out a worn plank of cedar. He began sanding, his hands steady, the rhythm of it familiar, purposeful. Later that day, he tucked the envelope into the back of his journal, not in front, not on display, just with the names. The ones that never got letters, the ones no one remembered. He didn't mention it to anyone. But that evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch light buzzed to life, he sat with his coffee and looked out over a town that had started to carry itself a little differently. The letter said he was a hero, but the people here had figured that out on their own. The teen showed up just after sunrise, a toolbox in one hand, lumber slung awkwardly over his shoulder. He didn't say much when he got there, just nodded at the man waiting on the porch. Mr. Halverson, a retired welder with a bum hip and a rusted walker, and set the wood down beside the front steps. It had been his idea. No one asked him to, no one expected it. But he'd overheard someone at the diner mention that Halverson hadn't been able to leave the house all winter. The ice, the steps, the pain, it kept him inside, kept him small, and something about that stuck. So now, here he was, gloves on, head down, work steady. He wasn't alone. 2 other kids from school had shown up, mostly quiet, a little unsure, following his lead. None of them had built anything before, but he remembered what Harold had told him that day on the bench. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up and try. So they measured, cut, drilled. They argued once about the angle, then figured it out. There was blood, nothing major, just a scraped knuckle, but no one complained. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the front yard. Mr. Halverson watched from a folding chair with a cup of black coffee in his lap and a look that said more than thanks ever could. At one point he tried to stand, tried to offer help, but the teen just shook his head gently and said, "We got it," and they did. By mid-afternoon, the ramp stood firm, simple, unpainted, solid. Nothing fancy, just functional, just enough. They tested it twice. Once with the walker, then again with a borrowed wheelchair, just to be sure. Each time it held smooth and steady, the way it was meant to. When it was done, the teen sat on the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that used to be a shirt sleeve. One of the other boys packed up the tools. The third snapped a quick photo, not for the internet, just to remember. They didn't leave a plaque, didn't ask for recognition, but as the teen stood to go, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden tag, roughly carved. Just 2 words etched into it with a pocket knife. Briggs Built. He nailed it into the corner post, just like he'd seen on the Clark's ramp. Halverson's voice cracked a little when he said, "You didn't have to do this." "I know," the teen replied. "That's why I did." And with that, he grabbed his toolbox, nodded once, and walked down the path toward home. The ramp stayed behind, catching the light, quiet, strong, just like the man who started it all. The town looked the same as it always had, cracked sidewalks, uneven curbs, telephone wires sagging like tired arms between poles. But as Harold walked, Kane tapping a steady rhythm beside his bootsteps, something felt different. It wasn't the buildings. It wasn't the weather. It was the way people saw him now. He didn't walk fast. Age had long taken speed from him, but not purpose. Every step had weight, not because of pain, but because he knew where he was going. He always had. The first nod came from the boy on the corner. He used to skate there with a cigarette tucked behind one ear and too much to prove. Today, he just stepped aside, eyes lowered, and gave a single, quiet nod. Harold returned it. Further down, a woman watering her garden paused when she saw him. Her smile was soft, not wide, not forced. She straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said, "Morning, Mr. Briggs. Nothing more, nothing less." At the bakery, two workers inside stopped rolling dough long enough to catch sight of him through the window. One tapped the other and pointed. They didn't wave, just stood there, still, as if witnessing something they didn't want to interrupt. The sidewalk cleared ahead of him, not out of fear, but reverence. It wasn't dramatic. No lines formed. No applause followed. Just subtle movements. People making room for something steady, something earned. At the post office, the clerk who used to barely glance up now held the door open for him. "Take your time," he said gently, as Harold passed. He walked by the high school, where a group of teenagers leaned against the fence. One of them, tall, wiry, hoodie pulled low, straightened when he saw the old man. He stepped forward, nervous but firm. "We're building a ramp this weekend," he said, voice rough with youth. "At the shelter. Just thought you should know." Harold stopped, looked at the boy, and nodded once. That was enough. The boy exhaled, stepped back, and didn't say another word. By the time Harold reached the corner of Maple and Fifth, the bus stop, he paused. Not to rest, but to look. The bench had been cleaned, someone had oiled the wood, tightened the bolts. At the end of the bench, a small bronze plaque had been installed. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. He sat down slowly, hands resting atop his cane, watching traffic crawl by. The town moved around him, gently, carefully, not because he demanded it, because he deserved it. Respect, he had once told a boy, doesn't come from medals or age. It comes from the life you choose to live when no one's looking, and now they were. The morning the plaque went in, no one made an announcement, no ribbon, no podium, no crowd. Just a single man in a city maintenance vest kneeling beside the bench with a cordless drill and a small velvet pouch. He worked quietly, brushing away the dust before placing the bronze rectangle into the pre-drilled holes. The screws turned slow and even, no rush. By the time the sun crested over the courthouse roof, the job was done. The plaque sat flush against the bench's edge, smooth and unassuming. Not flashy, not large. Just enough to be seen by those who stopped long enough to notice. In honor of those who serve without asking to be seen, beneath that, in smaller script, respect is earned in silence. People passed by all morning, some on their way to work, some walking dogs or pushing strollers. At first, no one said anything, but gradually they slowed. A few stepped closer. One woman ran her fingertips gently across the edge, as if testing whether the words were real. An older man stood for a long time in front of it, hands in his coat pockets, eyes clouded. When he finally turned to go, he didn't say a word, just touched the brim of his hat and nodded to the empty bench. At noon, Harold arrived. He didn't hurry. He never did. His boots crunched along the path, his cane tapping softly like a metronome in a quiet room. He paused a few feet from the bench, his gaze falling on the new addition. He didn't crouch or lean in, just stood there for a moment, shoulders squared against the years. Then, with the ease of routine, he sat. The plaque was at his side, shining just enough to catch the corner of his vision. He didn't reach for it, didn't trace the letters or speak them aloud. He just breathed. Around him, the town moved the way towns do. Traffic rolling, kids laughing in the distance, the low hum of the world carrying on. But a few people looked over as they passed, Some offered a wave, most just nodded. He nodded back. The bench wasn't his. It never had been. But something in it now belonged to more than just wood and bolts. It was a marker, not for one man, but for every quiet figure who had given more than they took, who had shown up, done the work, and walked home without needing to be noticed. The plaque didn't speak loudly. It didn't have to, because the ones who understood didn't need it explained, and the ones who didn't, well, they had a place to sit. And maybe, if they sat long enough, they'd start to understand too.